Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to this event, which unfortunately I cannot attend myself. I was in Greece last year and really enjoyed having some occasions to speak with people interested in my work. I'm very happy and honored that several excellent colleagues of mine will actually discuss my book here, and I look forward to getting feedback from my publisher Petros on how this event was. I have been asked to reflect on two things. First of all, to summarize roughly what is in this book, and then to speak a little bit about the future, which, as you will understand, is the most tricky part of this all. The book is, on the one hand, about populism, and on the other hand, about a specific form of it, namely Syriza. And so I was interested in Greek politics first because of the rise of the radical right. And only when I read a bit more, I read more about PASOK and the history of left-wing populism. When Syriza came out, most of the people that I would associate with, which are on the left, were very enthusiastic and considered it more as a traditional radical left party and had very little time for the populism aspect of it. Whereas I always focused on that aspect. And as I came to study them more and describe them more, I think that the populism aspect also played a more important role. And so the title is not so much the failure of radical left promise, it's the failure of populist promise, and I think it's an important difference between the two. I think the key reason why Syriza has failed, at least for the moment, and I don't see that change, is not necessarily what is called its radical left agenda, which has been toned down in the elections so much already that it is actually doable. They fail as a consequence of, I think, their incompetence. And that is directly related to their populism. So what populism does is it distinguishes society between two groups which are perceived homogeneous, the people which are pure and the elite that are corrupt. But because this distinction is moral, purity and corruption, compromise is impossible. The other thing is that generally when you're pure, you feel superior. And I think both can be seen very strongly in Syriza. Syriza believed that it had the truth. As a consequence, it didn't believe it needed to compromise. As a consequence, it didn't need to build coalitions. And it is this stubborn, but also, I think, incompetent way of politics that has cost them. It has cost them in the end with the bailout. It has also cost them with pretty much getting anything else done. The Anel government coalition was logical. It was logical for them in January 2015 because at that point in time, the memorandum and the opposition to it was the only point. And so Anel was the only other party in parliament that supported their utopian view of saying no to the memorandum, but yes to the Eurozone. Clearly that didn't work. And that didn't work because A, it was never an option, and B, because Syriza never tried to make coalitions with parties that could help. They didn't reach out to Renzi, they didn't reach out to Hollande. Instead, they reached out to Podemos, which had no power. But then, after the new elections in September, they chose again Anel. And that no longer made really that much sense outside of a populist framework. In terms of its content, in terms of its substantial politics, Anel and Syriza have very little in common. But in terms of the populism, they have exactly the same enemies. And that drove Syriza back to Anel which is now frustrating virtually every politics that it wants to do. And so the lesson that I learned from this, unlike the lesson that many others learned from it, is not that there is no space for radical left politics or left-wing politics. The lesson is there is no space for incompetent politics. If you do not take politics serious and build up skills, alliances, you cannot achieve anything. And so I think that is, in a nutshell, what the book is about. Now, let me be clear, not all populists fail. Right-wing populists are to a certain extent much more successful in pushing their agenda, particularly their agenda of nativism, anti-immigration. But that is in part because that is already shared by a lot of other people. With regard to the future, I'm not going to make many big statements because few things are as volatile as Greece these days. I do not see the Syriza government sitting out its whole term. That obviously is not revolutionary. I think, though, that Syriza has a huge incentive to continue as long as they can. First of all, they've seen the polls. And more importantly, ANEL has seen the polls. ANEL is pretty much dead if there are new elections, and so they have to sit as long as possible. Syriza is falling rapidly. Now, the new leader, Mitsotakis of New Democracy, is both a big threat and a big opportunity for Syriza. It's a big threat because he actually has, in a sense, energy, promise, hope that, to a certain extent, Tsipras had and has lost. He potentially can bring together everything that is within the center and center-right, which means that there are only two real actors, Syriza and MD. Obviously, 5% for KKE, 5% for Golden Dawn, but those are outside of the range of everyone. But he also provides a new opportunity because in many ways, he is the personification of what Syriza sees as the elite. He comes from the established families, from the corrupt elite. He has worked abroad for the finance industry, which is the external enemy of Syriza. And as a consequence, he can be perceived and be made into a much more threatening opponent, which in terms of Syriza are enemies, than the previous leaders. And so to a certain extent, the new leader of MD gives an incentive for Syriza to continue for a while, because on the one hand, it's an actual threat, but it also gives them an opportunity to win back the electorate that it has lost, because they haven't lost it to anyone yet. They have lost it to the non-decided. And through Mitsotakis, they can build up an enemy and argue that, look, this is exactly the person I've told you about, but this one can actually win. So you have to vote for us to prevent that from happening. I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening and that I will see you at another time that I come back to Greece. Thank you very much.